Welcome to Utopian Horizons.
Welcome to Utopian Horizons, a podcast about utopias real and imaginary. This is a new podcast, so to explain to you my plans for it, what I'd like to do is cover a different utopia, dystopia, utopian thinker or movement in each episode. So this could include utopias and dystopias from science fiction, blueprints for a future of automated work, real places, cities, people who've tried to change the world, whether through inventions or ideas, movements, and all manner of other things. It's going to be a podcast about exploring a fascination with different visions of the future and alternative ways of living, about concrete developments and ideas that could change the way we live and the way our society is structured. It's about what utopian visions tell us about ourselves in the here and now, and about the power of utopia to spark imagination and motivate people to create change in their communities and even the world. I've got a few cool things lined up for future episodes in terms of guests and subjects. You can follow the podcast on Twitter at Utopian Horizons if you want to keep an eye on what's coming. But if there's anything anyone listening would like to see me cover that's somehow related to utopia, whether that be a novel, a film, a video game, a person, or anything else, you can tweet me at Utopian Horizons, email me on utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com, or get in touch on Facebook at facebook.com/utopianhorizons. Please do, because I'm eager to hear ideas and open to covering them. Anyway, on to this first episode, which doesn't cover a specific utopia. That's because I want this first episode to serve as something of an introduction to the subject. So whether you know very little about it or already have a good grounding in it, my hope is that it will have something for you, courtesy of my guest who knows her stuff. That guest is Fátima Vieira. She is Associate Professor at the University of Porto and has spent many years writing and teaching on the subject of utopia. She spent 10 years as a chair of the Utopian Studies Society of Europe and is working on a number of projects related to utopianism, so she knows what she's talking about. Before we get into the conversation with Fátima, I'm conscious that we quite quickly jump into talking about Thomas More's Utopia and perhaps don't explain too much about what that is. So for anyone who's listening who doesn't know, we're talking about a book first published in 1516, where a character recalls his experience of visiting a fictional island called Utopia. And in this book, he details how this perfect place has slaves, by the way, so it's not perfect by my standards, and I hope not yours too. But it's meant to be a detailing of a perfect place and how it's organised in terms of politics, religion, daily life, and so on. So it's kind of a blueprint for an ideal society. So I hope that clarifies things when it comes to what we're talking about. Now, on to my conversation with Fátima. Fátima, thank you very much for joining me on the podcast.
It's my pleasure.
The starting point is obviously a question that sounds rather simple, but I think it's actually quite complicated, which is, what is utopia?
Yeah. So utopia is a neologism, or at least it was a neologism when Thomas More created it back in 1516. And he created it to name the island that he describes in his book. And it is a neologism of Greek etymology, which literally means a non-place. But something that we need to say is that the concept of non-place is totally different from a place that does not exist. Because this neologism, it conveys a tension. On the one hand, the affirmation of a place which is asserted by the imagination of the utopian writer or the utopian thinker, who presents it as a possibility, as an alternative. And so this is a positive movement. And then we have the negation, we have the denial of the physical existence of the place, which has been asserted. And in fact, I would say this is all what utopia is about, a tension between what we are and what we can possibly be.
And obviously we're talking about Thomas More, his utopia, giving birth to the term, but has utopia as this idea of like what we could be, what places could we be, has that existed previously to More's utopia?
I would say that we need to draw a line between utopian thought and utopian literature, because if we are thinking about utopian literature, then of course it starts with Thomas More. But I would say that utopian thinking exists ever since the moment when the human being started to think about the problems of the society he lived in and try to imagine ways of solving the problems and working towards a better future. But something needs to be said about utopian thinking, because it's not at all wishful thinking. It involves critical thinking, it involves an analysis of the present situation, but it is a critical thinking which is highly political. And I mean that in the sense that it tries to identify the causes of the problems, and also because it requires from the utopian thinker a capacity for devising new ways of organizing society in view to solve those problems. So it's not wishful thinking. It's a completely different thing.
And obviously, we see that in Thomas More's Utopia. It's essentially almost a blueprint for another place. It points to how things could be different. It tries to address problems that exist within the time that he's writing. I just wanted to ask, what do you think, are there any other kind of key examples of utopia throughout history? So More's Utopia is obviously a very famous one. I mean, do you look back at things like Plato's Republic?
We have, first of all, what I would call the prefigurations of utopia. That is, those texts that were written before Thomas More set the basis for the literary genre. And of course, Plato's Republic would be the most obvious example. But also, this one is taken from the Greek antiquity. Perhaps we could give another example taken from the Middle Ages, St. Augustine's, the City of God. But I would say that these prefigurations are very different from More's Utopia, because they lack the strengths of utopia, which is to describe a utopian society in motion, something that really exists. That's what Thomas More is doing. He is describing a society in motion. And what happens is that Plato, although he discussed the foundations of an alternative society, the alternative society is always presented as a speculation. And St. Augustine in the City of God, he seems more interested in projecting his ideal society into the afterlife. So Thomas More did something which is completely different. And first of all, I would say that he started a subversive tradition. And this needs to be said, because that is one of the main features of utopia. It enables the utopian authors to dismiss any responsibility regarding what they are describing. They may always say, as I'm sure that More certainly did, I am just describing what someone else described to me. And so there is this radical tradition that needs to be acknowledged, and that reaches its highest moment in the 17th century with Winstanley, for example, in the law of freedom, in a platform where he suggests that property should be abolished, that wages should be abolished. Another example would be James Harrington, who in Oceana suggests that ownership of property is limited. And it is this radical tradition that we find again in the second half of the 19th century in the work of William Morris, News from Nowhere, for example. And again, I would say in the 20th century, mainly in the 1960s and 1970s, when utopian literature is used to convey ecological concerns, but when it is also seen as a means for criticism and for opening up new perspectives for women and the place of women in society. And then we have, of course, science fiction, which goes back to Francis Bacon's New Atlantis, which is called nowadays considered a scientific utopia. So there are many highlights, I would say, in this utopian tradition.
Well, that radical tradition and that critical function is something I certainly want to talk more about in a bit. But something that I think is quite important to understand when talking about what utopia is its relationship to dystopia.
Yes.
Someone that's sort of clarified my thinking on dystopia was a guy called Tom Moylan, writing about science fiction, and he pointed out that dystopia is not necessarily the opposite to utopia, which is what you kind of most people will instinctively assume. His argument is that dystopia, a fictional dystopia, can point towards positive, the way of changing society for the better, in the same way that a utopia can. It can have agents of change who are trying to change the dystopia. You take the example of somebody like William Gibson and his cyberpunk novels. He's depicting a society where corporations are unhindered by political constraint. They can go across borders. They can control people in society. And that obviously points to things in our society that are bad, trends in our society that are bad.
Sure.
And it is a kind of utopian drive in putting those warnings there. I wonder if that view of dystopia is one you would share.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, and I totally subscribe to Tom Moylan's and Raffaella Baccolini's and other authors' view. And in fact, back in 2013, I edited a book entitled Dystopian Matters. And I invited a number of authors to write a very short text explaining why dystopia is important. And they all described dystopia as utopia's sibling. And in fact, Utopia and Dystopia, they share the same goal. I would say that the only difference is that they resort to different strategies, because Utopia resorts to what I would call a positive strategy by offering us a picture of a brighter future, of what we may reach if we work towards it. And it also shows us the path to take. While dystopia, it resorts to a negative strategy. It offers a picture of a darker future, one which we may only prevent in case we manage to change the present. So I'd say that dystopia, although it resorts to a negative strategy, it aims to reach a positive goal, a better society. And it also aims to drive us to action. So the objective, the goal, is exactly the same as utopia.
But you can also have anti-utopian utopias and anti-utopian dystopias.
Yeah, but in this case, with the difference, I would say that utopias and dystopias, they are together in the same group, but anti-utopianism is completely different. So anti-utopianism is a discourse on the fact that it is no worth thinking about alternatives. The anti-utopias, they show us that then you live in dreams, that that utopias are of no use. So I'd say that anti-utopias are very different from dystopias, also in their goal.
Also, anti-utopia is connected to that idea that utopia is inherently totalitarian, like it can only lead to...
Yeah, they can also show, that's one of the things that they can show. So the anti-utopian discourse has been founded, I would say, on two main arguments. On the one hand, this idea that utopia is just wishful thinking, and on the other hand, this idea that utopia leads to totalitarian societies. But I would resort to Marie-Louise Berneri's argument that she put forward in the 1950s already, saying that the problem is not with utopias and with utopian thinking, but with the people that resort to utopian thinking.
Yeah, sure. Okay, I just wanted to return to Thomas More's Utopia for a moment. Obviously, it's a very important text in the history of utopia. Reading your article you wrote about it, you called More a founder of discursivity. I just wondered if you could explain a bit about what you meant by that.
Sure. So in my view, utopia deserves to be celebrated, not so much because it started a new literary genre, but because it starts a new way of thinking about our present and about the possibilities for our future. And it was Michel Foucault who first wrote about the founders of discursivity. And he was referring to authors who set the possibilities and who set the rules for the formation of other texts. And for Foucault, the most obvious examples of founders of discursivity were Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud. Mm-hmm. But I would like to argue that we could well add Thomas More to this list, as I truly believe that Thomas More offered his contemporaries a totally new perspective, which can really be seen as a revolution of thought. Now, if we think of Thomas More as a founder of discursivity, we need, of course, to identify and to describe the Foundation Act. And I would say that his Foundation Act was that Thomas More offers us a practice of thinking where the discourse on the other is centered on oneself. And what I mean by this is that in his book, Thomas More describes the island of Utopia, but the inhabitants of Utopia are in fact dislocated Europeans. Mm-hmm. The other that we are told about, the other is only important because it provides us with a space for reflection on how the utopians were afflicted by the same problems that afflicted the Europeans were dealing with them. But when I say that Thomas More was a founder of discursivity, I'm also thinking of another aspect, and I'm thinking of the fact that it set the possibilities and the rules for the formation of other texts, to resort to what Michel Foucault said. And this, I would say, explains why the utopian tradition is so rich and why it has evolved. And it is true that sometimes the solutions that are offered by utopian texts, they seem out of date. And that is when people talk about the death of utopia. But utopia does not die. The solutions for the problems it seeks to solve, they change. I would say, for instance, in the 16th and the 17th centuries, the utopian recipe would involve laws were needed because the human being was not to be trusted. But in the Enlightenment, for instance, the emphasis was put on education. And in the 19th century, the main idea was revolution. It was the abolishment of property, an idea that, in fact, had already been put forward in the 17th century. So I would say that utopian solutions are not eternal, but utopian thinking is, and it is open to renewal. When I'm talking about utopian thinking, I have mainly in mind what I would call 4 modes of thinking. And the first mode of thinking would be perspective thinking. This idea that we need to define an horizon towards which we want to walk. And it is important that this horizon is inflated of possibilities, even if some of them do not seem completely realizable, because we need to have a surplus of desire. We need to have something to make us want to proceed, to go on. Otherwise, when we reach the horizon, we stop, and then we do not want, of course, utopia to crystallize. We want it to be dynamic. Now, the second mode of thinking would be critical thinking. And critical thinking is required both for the analysis of the present and for the option of the path that we want to take. And utopian thinkers need the skills of critical thinkers because their choices need to be validated by reason, and the consequences of those choices need to be analyzed as well. And then the third mode would be holistic thinking. This awareness that societies work as systems and that economic, social, political, ecological problems, they are all interconnected, and that if we are seeking solutions for our society, we need to think of society as a whole. And finally, the fourth mode of thinking would be creative thinking. The fact that our imagination is triggered by the question, what if I did this? What other possibilities could I have? And then, of course, I'd say that this question opens up for us a myriad of possibilities. And that is, in fact, one of the main functions of literary utopias and also of science fiction. They tell us of different ways of living. And this is an important feature of utopian thinking as well.
I think what you're talking about there leads us on to a conversation about what it is that utopia does, how it functions, why it's important. I was just going to say, I think it also be it can be easy to get into the habit of thinking about utopia as simply being about the future. But I think it's important to realise that it does impact on the here and now.
Yes, I would say that is exactly one of the main features of utopian thinking, is that although it deals with our future, and I have to say that this idea of utopias being about the future, it started in the late 18th century, because before, utopias would describe other places that already existed, in the same time. So the Uchronias, or the concept of Uchronia, of a time of happiness, started in the late 18th century in France. But this really is another feature of utopian thinking, that although they deal with our future, in fact, they are trying to highlight what is wrong with our present, and they urge us to act to change what is wrong about our present.
Yeah, they give us solutions, strategies.
Yes, they do.
Critiques that we can apply now to try and make things better. Something which I've got quite an interest in science fiction, and which obviously is intimately related to utopia, and something I wanted to talk about was in how utopia functions is there's this idea of estrangement in science fiction, right? Which probably everybody has experienced. Like when you start to read a science fiction novel, there are words, ideas, the way things are organized that you've struggled to understand at first. They seem weird and strange, and then you later realize that they relate to things that you experience and the way things are now. And that kind of gap, that moment where they seem weird and alien and strange, opens up a space of criticism, because those things are no longer natural to you. I know that's something you've talked about in Utopia, and in your writing about Utopia, you've talked about giving the capacity for thinking differently, for trying to devise new ideas. You talked about how our brains being deformed by the society we live in and by our habits of thought, so that we can't even think about other possible forms of organisation. So it seems to me like that's a key function of Utopia, the way it allows us to see what appears as natural as anything but, and give us that critical space.
Yes, I'd say that the notion of estrangement is very important. Utopian and science fiction texts, they offer us new perspectives. And you're right when you perhaps I'd like to add another aspect to what you said about this notion of estrangement, is that what you may think to be odd at first, once someone explains it to you, once you understand the rationale behind it, then things may start to make sense. That would be another function of estrangement, and that is what Ursula Le Guin's stories. That's why Ursula Le Guin's stories are so important. As regards the concept of family, the concept of gender, what it is about being a woman, a man, if these categories make sense at all. So we have that space for criticism. So when you see that you mentioned, when you see that there's a distance between what we have and what you could have, and then you have this idea that once you understand how things work, then perhaps you can also understand that you could adopt exactly the same solutions in your society.
Yeah, as you're saying. So in that way, it can not only present what appears natural as unnatural, it can also present what initially appears as unnatural as actually quite natural.
You're right.
Yeah. Something I also want to talk to you about is whether we go through like utopian eras or golden ages. Reading your work, I came across a word which I've not heard before, a French word, avenir. Is that correct pronunciation?
Yeah.
Could you explain a bit about what that is? Because that seems to me like you were suggesting that's kind of a prerequisite for utopian thinking.
Yes, I have to use that word in English. It's a French word. In Portuguese, I would say in the Romance languages, we have this distinction between the idea of future and avenir. And so the concept of avenir is very important, because when we're talking about future, Future is about what will come, what is certain, what will happen. We have past, present, future. And this concept was the prevailing one until the 17th century. And that's why people used to try to predict the future. That was certain to happen. And the concept of avenir is totally different. It has to do with the possibility of the future. So it has to do with what may happen if we work towards it. So in English, as I said, we do not have this concept of avenir. Perhaps we could replace it by using future in the plural. So instead of thinking about the future, we could think about new possible futures. It would be the same. And this concept of avenir is important because it has to do with our agency, with our capacity to bring about, alternatives, to bring about new possibilities.
So that's obviously a big change from before that concept kind of arose, or that way of thinking arose. People tend to think it was kind of an era of prophecy, right? Like everything was set out, like human history was set out, Nostradamus and so forth. Yeah. So this obviously provides a different way of seeing the world and a capacity for thinking about difference. But yeah, going. Do you think we go through like cycles of utopian eras, like golden ages? I always think of the 60s as being an era where there was a lot of utopian fiction. You had intentional communities, which for anyone listening who doesn't know what an intentional community is, it's basically a community set up around a particular idea or way of living. So, I mean, do we go through these ages where utopia kind of booms?
Yes, I would say the 60s and 70s, they were no doubt very important moments for intentional communities. As far as literature is concerned, I would say that we have Renaissance utopias, and then throughout the Enlightenment, we do not have many examples, but in the 19th century for sure. Nowadays, there is a dystopian trend as far as literature is concerned, but we have many intentional communities. In fact, they have very small communities, and actually, I quite enjoyed the idea of thinking of them as utopian labs. Mm-hmm. That's where people are making experiments with new possibilities, and they lack, of course, the dimension, because there are problems that you may solve if you are thinking in a small scale, that will never be solved in a big scale, but they are very important because they have to do with this idea that you are changing society bit by bit, and it has to do with a new way also of thinking about utopia, because in the past we had this grand narrative. And that is why also, going back to this idea of the anti-utopia or the anti-utopian discourse, this idea that utopias may bring about dictatorship, that is a valid argument if you are thinking about the grand narratives of the past, because you had to impose the main idea of utopias. But nowadays, contemporary utopianism deals with reform, with the concept of, taking step by step, of working, at a small scale. And then, of course, you can only participate in the change if you agree with the idea, with rationale behind that project. And so I would say that utopian discourse is very much alive within these intentional communities. There are many, many communities nowadays, at least in Europe, they are rising in number every day, mostly because of ecological concerns. People are going back to the land. They are, growing vegetables because they cannot find jobs, in the big cities. So they are growing up. Also, they are increasing in number.
You mentioned the grand narrative kind of utopia there. That links to, many people have suggested that 1989, the fall of communism, there was kind of a death of utopia. Yeah. And we have this idea of the end of history, where we've basically, in capitalism, we've found, if not the best, then the least worst system. And there will be, you can change things here and there, but basically we have certain parameters that sets how things are, and things aren't really going to change, which I think we're seeing something of a crisis of that idea now. But I just wondered, do you think that the fall of communism, that period, led to a kind of boom of anti-utopianism?
Yeah, I would say that what we are talking when people said that utopia was dead, they were referring to the political project, to a political solution, and that's where the difference between what I would call philosophical utopia and political utopia makes sense. So there was a political solution which was not working anymore. So as I said, what dies, what is not seen as feasible anymore is the solution, a particular solution. But utopian thinking goes on, and then it acquires new life when it is inflated by new political solutions.
Do you feel like, to me, it feels like the 90s and the 2000s were, to me, at that time, utopia as a word has primarily been associated as like an insult, right? Like it's used to describe someone who's unrealistically dreaming. It feels to me like the 90s and 2000s were particularly anti-utopian. And I wonder if, say, in one of your articles, you quote Edgar Morin as saying that the crisis we live in today is a crisis of the imagination. And I wonder if you feel that anti-utopianism of the 90s and 2000s, that unwillingness to deviate from the system we've had, has contributed to the crisis we have today in terms of the rise of far-right politics, which we're seeing across Europe, in America. Is that not in part a crisis of utopianism?
Yeah, I would say that it was a consequence for sure for the fact that people, because they thought that it was no worth thinking about different alternatives, because that it would be much better to try to make the best of what they had. So they ceased to think, in the future, and also the consequences and the alternatives. So I would say that the 19th and the first years of the 21st century, because they did not think about alternatives, they did not think about the future, they did not prepare the future, and we are living the consequences of it. But what is interesting is that also because last year in 2016 we commemorated the 500th anniversary of the publication of Thomas More's Utopia. All over the world, there were people who used the word utopia, who revived the word and the concept. So I'd say that nowadays, this is part of our vocabulary, and it is now related to the idea of citizenship, of participatory democracy, of plenty of new ideas that have to do with the way that we are preparing our future.
Mm. Personally, I think there's still this kind of crisis of imagination in mainstream left politics.
Yeah.
Like, we still see utopia is inherently compelling. It allows us to imagine that things could be better for ourselves. And I think we're seeing on the left that there's a lot of people who are still thinking that we live in the world of the 90s and the 2000s, that things aren't going to change.
Yeah.
It seems to me like the right, talking about people like Donald Trump, for example, the world he's trying to create isn't a utopian one for me personally, but it seems to be like he draws on utopian language.
Yeah.
Like he's saying that we can change things, and it seems like the right has been far better at exploiting utopian language today than the left.
Yeah, but it's the utopia of the grand narratives. So it's different from what I'd say contemporary utopianism. But you're right when you mentioned, the crisis of imagination. It was Edgar Morin who described the crisis that we're living in, and he said what he says is that our brain, we are not used anymore thinking about possibilities, and so our brain, because it has not been trained, it is difficult for us to think about them. But the good news that has been conveyed by different studies, and neuroscientists that are saying this every day, is that our brain is capable of changing, and we know that it has already started to change because of the internet. Nowadays we are multitask, so I would say that I do hope that in the future we we will be also trained to think differently. But one of the things going back to what you said, you're right, the right-wing discourse explores utopian thinking, but it would be this idea of the project, not the project which is participated by the people and made by the people, but the project which is imposed on the people. But there's something that I'd like to mention, and actually I have to thank Denise Baden for this. I've been working with her on a project. We have just started it, and she highlights the need to incorporate the idea of positive psychology in the utopian discourse. The fact is that normally we know that the dystopian discourse is as effective as the utopian discourse, in the sense that if you show people images of a future which is worse than our present, then you are also, making people or forcing people to take action. But in fact, what Denise Baden says is that we should teach utopia, for instance, in schools, utopian thinking in schools, and we should promote positive psychology, and we should promote this idea that we can make the change, so that the change does not come from above, from the government, but it comes from the citizens. And this, you are totally right, is what still needs to be explored by left-wing discourse.
Yeah, because I think what you're saying is very important, that utopianism can be almost like anti-nihilistic. It's very easy to think that, it's very easy to get depressed about the course we're on and think that it's not possible to change things. But utopian thinking, it allows us to believe that we can change things. And of course, history is full of examples of people making massive changes.
Yeah.
Something I think we've touched on but not gone into in depth that I'd like to talk about is something you've written about, which is the difference between philosophical utopia and political utopia. So could you explain a little bit about what the difference is between those two things?
Yeah, so the political utopia is about a project, a utopian project that is conceived, that is created to solve a particular problem. So communism was a political utopia. And then we have the philosophical utopia, which is what has survived throughout history. And that is this idea that we may change. That's because that's precisely what Thomas More discovered, and that's why we did not have utopian thinking before him. That was the great discovery of the Renaissance, that we are able to change our future, and that we have the responsibility of creating our own future. So the philosophical utopia always questions the present, and it always asks the same question: is there a way of making things better? So the philosophical utopia has to do with an attitude, and the political utopia has to do with a recipe for change. And it is precisely the political utopia that dies out, when the solutions that are offered are not, feasible anymore. And then it is the philosophical utopia which survives. I would say that in the 1990s and in the first years of the 21st century, it was the philosophical utopia that really survived, because the political utopia had been forgotten, I would say. But nowadays, the political utopia is reviving, and I would say that the responsibility for this revival can be attributed to, for instance, Donald Trump. It can be attributed to Brexit, because people now they cannot accept the current policies, and because you cannot just say I don't want this. Then you have to think about alternatives. And so I would say that we are living in promising times, in the sense, and that I'm sure that new alternatives will be put forward and hopefully put in practice as well.
Now, you mentioned that philosophical utopia you think was kind of the more dominant thing from sort of the 90s onwards. I got the sense in reading what you've written that you think that there's some worth in rehabilitating political utopia. So he talks about utopia losing the clear ideological commitment it used to have at the time of the grand utopias narratives. You cite Darren Webb arguing that the liberal rejection a priori of blueprint utopianism has reduced utopian pedagogy to a process of questioning and emptied utopia of valid guiding images. So it seems to me that you're suggesting that we need these guiding images. So am I misreading you, or do you think we need to rehabilitate?
Yeah, no, that's. I think that you're reading from an article that I wrote about the philosophical utopia, because for many years I stood for this idea that we do not need political utopias, we need philosophical utopias. But then I read this article by Darren Webb, where he said that there's a problem with our schools, what is being taught to our students, because there's something which is very positive, which is the pedagogy of questions. So our students are being told that they should ask questions. But the problem is that they are taught to ask questions, but not to look for answers.
Yeah.
And so perhaps you should combine the two things. So it's very good that they are not told what to think, that they have to question everything. So of course, critical thinking is needed. But then perhaps we could, sometimes it is also the role of the teacher, to offer some idea of the horizons that that should be reached. So I would say that that's why I believe, and that was exactly when I was finishing my article, Standing for Philosophical Utopia, that I read Darren Webb's article. And then I came to the conclusion that we do need to rescue the political utopia. And of course, I'm not talking about, offering definite solutions, but perhaps guiding images such as the participation of people in the creation of the alternatives. So participatory democracy, why not? So perhaps we could show the advantages of these new possibilities.
Yeah, I certainly agree that I think offering concrete ideas certainly has its value. One other thing I wanted to touch on when we're talking about the points of utopia is something that you've already mentioned, which is it encourages a way of thinking systemically. And I think that's very important today because we're living in a crisis of capitalism where the neoliberal model we've been living in is breaking down. We're facing ecological catastrophe.
Yeah.
We're likely to see the kind of crisis of immigration is actually likely to become the norm as different places become inhabitable thanks to the ecological crisis. So something that you've talked about is that utopianism gives us a way to address these problems as systems, right?
Yeah, it has to do with the holistic thinking that the utopian thinking entails. This idea that when you think of a solution, then you have to see all the consequences of that solution. That societies they work as systems, and then you have to think of all the aspects at the same time. You cannot just take a decision as far as economy is concerned without thinking of all the other aspects of religion, for instance, of social consequences. So the systemic nature of utopianism is very important, and that is also why people are so interested in reading, for instance, utopian literature, because what we are offered is a full picture of the society with and all the aspects are covered, and we can see that all the aspects are really interconnected. And you're also right when you mentioned, the people that we have to welcome to Europe. We have to think of strategies to welcome them, and thinking of all the aspects, not only the social and economic, but all the other aspects of our life.
Okay, something that I want to move on to. You mentioned to me in a previous conversation, we're exchanging emails, that you were working on the digital turn and what that means for utopia. So for anyone who doesn't know what the digital turn is, could you briefly explain what that is, first of all, and then how you see that impacting on utopia?
Yeah, it has to do with the fact that we are now discussing things on the internet, and that information is on the internet. And I would say that, first of all, there's this notion of co-emplacement that started with the internet. This idea that the people that I meet now, that with whom I discuss my ideas, are not anymore my neighbors or the people that are attending my school or the people that I work with, but the people with whom I share a set of values and ideas. And the internet made it possible for us to be part of a wider movement. And then we have access now to more information, and it is easier to denounce what is wrong, as is happening, I would say, every day, for instance, in the United States. But then the digital turn has also to do with this idea that we can start projects together. We can, both of us, we can have a project, even if I'm living here in Portugal and you are, so far away from me.
Mm-hmm.
And also the fact that and now we have access, for instance, to a lot of texts and to a lot of utopian texts that were not available anymore, that you could only read if you could, if you could go to the British Library, for instance. And so I would say that the digital turn will give, strength to the utopian thought and to perhaps a utopian movement.
That could be quite important. You mentioned making connections with people across, not neighbours, across borders, and we're seeing a resurgence in nationalism, I think, again in Europe and the US. So those kind of connections could be quite important to combat that.
Yeah, sure.
One final thing I'd like to talk to you about is something which you're working on, which is the Utopia 500 project. So could you tell me what that is, please?
Yeah, so we started this project last year because we wanted to commemorate the 500th anniversary of the publication of Thomas More's Utopia. And but the project is still called, now that we are in 2017, it's still called Utopia 500, and it will hopefully go on for many years. And so what we're doing at University of Porto, we are welcoming trainees, Erasmus trainees, that is, young people who have just graduated from the university and who join us and who join our team within the framework of Erasmus mobility programs. And we have many projects. We started, these are mainly outreach projects. So we are resorting to the idea of positive psychology. We have a project which is called Pan Utopia. So that is, utopia everywhere, total utopia. And we are fighting food waste. And we are going to schools. And it's incredible to see how young people have wonderful ideas. For instance, in a neighboring town here in Valongo, we signed a protocol with mayor. Valongo is now the first utopian city. Okay. With the students of Porto, with students of Valongo, trying to devise strategies to change the town. It has been wonderful. For instance, they already have a fridge which belongs to the community, where you can leave, the food that you're not having. And they have many, many other ideas. We also have another project which we are promoting now in Valongo, but we want to have this project everywhere. It's called Great Utopians, People with Ideas That Have Changed the World. Mm-hmm. And what we are trying to do is to identify the people who really made the difference. So the message that we want to convey is that we can make the difference, we can make a difference. And so we are now trying to create new maps of towns where instead of built heritage, you have cultural heritage, where you have the name of the persons who lived there and who did small things, but things that were relevant for the community, that really changed the community. And so our idea is to produce, maps of many towns in order to enhance the importance of individual activities, individual projects. We also have the guest book project here in Portugal. It is a project which is coordinated by Richard Kearney, and it has to do with communities that have problems. Here in Porto, what we are doing, we are celebrating multiculturalism multiculturality. And we are trying to work this concept of hospitality, which is so important when we are thinking about all the people that are now arriving in Europe and that we have to welcome and whose traditions, beliefs we have to respect. So in this project, you can find information on it if you just write utopia500.net. And I'm saying this because we want to welcome, so far we had 60 students or 60 trainees coming from all over the world, and we really want to benefit from the contribution and the enthusiasm of any utopian thinkers that may be listening to us now.
Cool. Well, they sound like great projects, so good luck with those. And
thank you.
Thank you very much for joining me.
Most welcome. It was really my pleasure. Thank you.
So that's the end of my conversation with Fátima. I hope you've enjoyed the episode. If so, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or whatever it is you're using to listen to this. Obviously, this is a new podcast and it's something I'd like to grow and keep doing. So with that in mind, if you could take a brief moment to rate or review the podcast on iTunes or whatever it is that you're using, that type of stuff really does help with the podcast exposure and it will help it to grow and help me to keep doing this. So if you could take a moment to do that, that would be massively, massively appreciated. Also, if you've got any feedback or, as I said before, any ideas for things you'd like to be covered, please let me know. Again, you can email me at utopianhorizonspod@gmail.com, tweet me at Utopian Horizons, and there's a Facebook page at facebook.com/Utopian Horizons. I'll be back soon with another episode. Until then, thanks for listening.